Hello and welcome to PFI Talks, brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, cooperating with the leading Czech economics research center, Sergej EI. My name is Slaus Rusek. I'm the head of communications at PPF Group and also the host of this podcast. It's my great pleasure to welcome John Cochrane, a finance and economics professor at Stanford University and the senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Apart from writing and co-writing many books, including the most recent called Crisis Cycle on the Evolution of Euro, Professor Cochrane is also known for his The Grumpy Economist newsletter, published on Substack. Welcome to PFI Talks, Professor.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
I can't help it, but I have to start. What makes you the grumpiest these days about the state of global or U.S. economy?
Oh, I'm actually not grumpy, except for occasionally if I read New York Times op-eds and spill my coffee. That's how I got the nickname Grumpy Economist from my son. We have lots of challenges in the economy today, and I wish we were growing a lot faster than we are and getting rid of a lot of cobwebs in our economic systems.
Well, actually, since you touched on the growth, it seems like in the US, the contribution to the GDP growth coming from the AI, shall we call them prospective future growth, is actually really spectacular, while AI still contributes to very little to the overall GDP levels. Do you see it as some sort of a start of a potential bubble or the end of a cycle, or where are we at? There are all these analogies about, dot-com boom and bust and everything.
I'm actually very hopeful. Now, there was if you want to call it a bubble, in the stock market related to the internet, but it turned out, pretty well. So that the tech really was the defining feature of the post, of the 2000s and 2010s, and brought great benefits to all sorts of people. So even though the stock market got a little bit ahead of itself in the late 1999s, the underlying investment was good too, and I'm hopeful for that in AI as well. As in the internet, we have tech. Look at us, we're talking on Zoom. Isn't that wonderful?
Of course it is.
But the shareholders in Netscape, Yahoo, and AOL Time Warner didn't necessarily come out okay, even though the fundamental products that those companies represented are now the backbone of our economies everywhere. That's likely true with AI as well. Which individual company is going to end up making a lot of money for its shareholders, I don't know. But I'm very hopeful that AI permeates everything we do and reinvigorates economic growth. Why? Yeah. For my entire professional life, the worry has been the opposite, the slowdown of economic growth. The sense that we are running out of ideas, the sense that this wonderful thing that has brought unbelievable amounts of human prosperity is now over because there's nothing left to do. Now, I've always been a believer that there's plenty of ideas, we just can't get the permits, that the creeping regulation has been the thing stopping growth. But the economic question for my lifetime has been the slowdown of growth and the enormous loss of that, the increase in prosperity we could be having. For Europe, there's not just the slowdown in the sort of idea-led growth. Europe's growth essentially stopped in 2010. So the deeper question for Europe is, why is Europe 40% poorer than the US? And the US is pulling away. That doesn't need new ideas. That doesn't need AI. That just needs become only as dysfunctional as the US. And everybody can have a 40% higher living standard. And let me assure you, things aren't perfect economically here as well. So that slowdown in growth, I think, is mostly due to overregulation and taxation and so forth, but we can argue where it comes from. And especially for Europe, the slowdown in relative growth, that is the economic challenge. And AI brings me great hope. It's kind of funny. We've spent 50 years saying growth is slowing down and it's kind of the end of this wonderful thing. Along comes the one thing that really arguably might turn it around. And people are talking about growth there'll be the singularity, growth will go to infinity. And let's worry about it. If only we had such things to worry about, economic growth taking way off and then arguing about who gets the benefits.
Well, there is also this argument about that, the AI-driven growth will be about winner takes all. So it may actually lead to a lot of, displacement, a lot of menial jobs being replaced. But you're not concerned about, jobs and, sort of vocations, occupation from humankind disappearing.
Sure. Now, in how many times have we seen this play out before?
Many times.
1492, Gutenberg invents movable type. The monks are out of a job. We invent it's serious. In the Industrial Revolution, we invented machines that made thread and then made cloth. Weavers are out of a job. In 1900, 70% of Americans worked on the farm. We invented tractors. Oh my God, 70% of Americans are going to be sitting around in the streets for another 100 years with nothing to do, dying in the gutter. Turns out that they found better jobs in the factories. 1970s, women joined the workforce, a wonderful thing, but what women's jobs at the time were typing and typing multiple copies of things with carbon paper in between them. Oh my God, the word processor and the Xerox machine are invented. They'll all be out of a job. That worked out fine. I mean, over and over again. Yes, there will be, some people will gain, some people will lose. I actually think the ones most in danger are, accountants, bill processors, low-level lawyers, people who sort of fill out forms. It's not low-skilled workers this time. Try to get a plumber, at least try to get a plumber in Palo Alto, and because AI can't fix your plumbing. They'll be fine. But
there's been a series of Wall Street Journal articles about the HVAC, occupation and work.
HVAC installers. Yeah. I cannot get one to show up. And anyway, but I have every time before what's happened is when you get a tool that allows humans to do kind of rote stuff more efficiently, the first thing that happens is costs fall, so the market expands enormously. When ATM machines were invented, we did not have bank tellers out in the streets dying in the gutter. Banks expanded. Bank employment expanded. They moved into financial services. They were able to leverage the technology to expand the size of what they were doing. And people will now be able to use AI. In fact, people will now have access to the smartest people around them to help them do their jobs. So, ever since, 1250, the invention of pulleys that do better, we've seen over and over again technology that displaces some human activities, and everybody ends up better off, though, along the way, some people do worse off.
But what you've been sort of describing, we can probably all lump it into this, is all sort of like the growth will be driven by, in the West and in the US, will be driven by the idea economy, by new ideas, by tech. But what about actually sort of manufacturing, doing the things with your hands and also sort of like applying what you learn, what you do in technology? And I'm alluding to the fact that there is a discrepancy between where the Chinese tech is headed at the moment, and it's actually in many fields, China is actually taking over the US and the West. How long can you actually sustain growth if the basic research doesn't really correlate with the sort of a tangible, results of all that research or applications?
So long as we're not at a war with each other, it's great. Mm-hmm. Which would you rather be doing? Writing the software and the intellectual property, or sitting there 12 hours a day on a production line screwing in the faces of iPhones? A wonderful system that Europe, a lot of Europe has very cutting edge technology, even manufacturing technology. So, designing the new stuff and doing the very high edge, cutting edge, and doing your manufacturing with machines, not with people, and letting China and then Vietnam and Malaysia do all the hard stuff is a great division of labor. That can go on forever, so long as you don't start a war with each other. But that's a separate issue. So and how long do countries? Maybe we should go back to agriculture. The real source of wealth is the land. How long can you go on building machines and sending them abroad, and other people send you food? That's not sustainable. We should all stop this manufacturing and go back and hoe the land. Come on. Yeah, it's the same.
Well, zooming down to like the micro of U.S. technology. All this talk about maybe the U.S. taking a the U.S. government taking a 10% stake or some sort of a stake in Intel, the extra tariff or tax, if you will, on Nvidia and other U.S. tech companies to allow them to actually get export licenses to China. Is the U.S. actually headed towards some sort of a form of state capitalism, or is this a sort of a temporary adjustment? Or are you worried about that?
I'm very worried about that.
Mm-hmm. And why?
We got to face it, in many manufacturing areas, the Chinese are simply better. They have managed to figure out how to do things at lower cost. They are not producing great electric cars just because they have subsidies for cars. The U.S. has plenty of subsidies for cars, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies for cars, and our car companies still can't make, good, cheap electric cars that compete with it. So, the answer is competition. The answer is either learn to do that thing better or learn to do something else better. If you retreat into protection, then what you end up doing is putting a wall around inefficient things, and they stay inefficient forever. And of course, they get very good at getting more protection as opposed to producing better products at lower prices. The US has protected steel for generations now, and the result is a completely inefficient steel industry. We've protected merchant marine since the 1920s, and the result is we make ships at 5 times the cost of China's, and never produces an innovative, competition is the only thing that gets you an innovative, low-cost thing. And yes, the move in the U.S. is towards, we put in big tariffs, and then if you're Tim Cook, you go to Washington and you chat up Trump and you get an exemption from the tariffs. So that, and the same was under Biden. You have to have the benevolence of the regulators. The regulatory state is very arbitrary and capricious. And so doing the political will of the regulator or the president in return for not having the whole regulatory apparatus shut you down is an increasing trend in the US. And I don't like crony capitalism any more than I like socialism. They're both very bad for economic growth. So
do you think that we are sort of moving in the direction of, quite recently, given all the sort of military conflicts, including Ukraine, and we'll touch on that later, there's all this talk about, geopolitics. All of a sudden, geopolitics is playing some role in like how companies assess their investment strategies and capex, outlays. But now they should be actually, in what you just said, more concerned about, growing regulation at home. In what up until now were very liberal jurisdictions like the U.S.
Yeah, well, if you're running a company, you got to go with the hand you're dealt, and if you have a state capitalist economy, you got to butter up the regulators and do what it takes. And certainly, geopolitically, you got to worry if you're going to invest abroad. You have to worry about, are they going to grab my factory under national security? And like, state capitalism, like its darker forms in Europe's history, often has, they say national security, but there's a certain national security hysteria. There is a national security argument for some economic interventions, but it is much more narrow. It needs to be much more narrow and precisely stated. We can't trade with China because they're bad. Is not a sensible national security strategy. Rare minerals. So we can't buy rare minerals from China because national security. Wait a minute. 99% of the rare earths that come to the U.S. don't go into making F-35 fighters. So the actual national security grounds we got to think about. And why do we not have rare earths in the U.S.? Because good luck getting a permit to open a rare earths mine in the U.S. So, looking at, rather than jump to protection, rather than jump to sort of North Korean levels of let's do things on our own under a vague national security grounds, I think is a big danger right now. America tends to be paranoid. In the 1960s, we bought the line that socialism was going to, central planning was going to crush us, as Nikita Khrushchev says. Then in the 1980s, Japan is going to come destroy American industry. So we tend to that kind of national security and economic hysteria.
So before last year's presidential election in the US, there was some tangible expectation that, if Trump wins, there will be more market-oriented reforms, there will be sort of deregulation, and, maybe it has just stayed in the form of a statement, the Liberation Day. Do you think that maybe we will still see some of that hope to be fulfilled, or completely doused?
We are seeing a good deal of it. So
okay.
The tariffs are occupying the front pages. However, we'll see how long the tariffs last in the courts.
Yeah.
We'll see how long the tariffs last when Trump is an excellent politician. He listens to what people want. If the tariffs end up causing the kind of economic damage that most of us think they will, Trump is likely to figure that out rather than shoot himself completely in the foot. But the deregulatory agenda is going on, and I think under the radar screen, and not just the deregulatory agenda, but stopping the endless expansion that was happening ahead of time. So the U.S., with Trump's election, is not going to follow Europe down economic suicide in the name, in policies that talk about climate but don't actually do anything to help the climate. So Europe is going down that route, and that's a big part of why Europe stopped growing. The U.S. is not going to do that. And I'm not denying climate change is real, but the policies the U.S. was and Europe is still following do tremendous economic damage and don't reduce carbon at all, or if they do, it's 0.00001 degree in 100 years. So they don't do it in at all a cost-effective way. The U.S. is not going to do that. We're going to start nuclear power again. Talking to you, Germany, and we're not going to keep subsidizing incredibly overpriced domestically made electric vehicles made by union labor with all sorts of Buy in America requirements, as if the planet cared where the electric cars were made. So we're not going to regulate AI to death, as Europe has done in its infancy. There's a big clean up the regulation effort going on. The tax stuff was a beginning, but at least movement in the right direction. So it was not. Donald Trump did not promise to be Javier Milei, and he is not Javier Milei. But there's a lot of little Javier Mileis hiding out in the economic policy sub-basements of the Trump administration. So a lot of that is going on, I think, is quite hopeful for the U.S.
I have to really restrain myself because I want to jump into that overregulation in the EU and all the discussion about whether the sort of new EU or the eastern part of the EU where I'm actually based, because I'm based in Prague, because there seems to be a sort of a big dose of common sense, in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, don't restrain yourself, please.
in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and all these countries, like, for example, the Czechs, were the Czech government has just commissioned building, expanding the country's oldest nuclear power plant. So it's actually happening. The tender has been won by the Korean energy conglomerate. But anyway, I want to stay on the U.S. economic policy.
And you're allowing foreigners to buy it. No, let's talk about Europe. You're allowing foreigners to build it, which the U.S. would never do, because the Koreans are actually, they know how to build effective, cheap nuclear power plants. Yeah, Czechoslovakia and Poland are bright spots in Europe. And I have great hope for Europe. I made grumpy comments, but there's a lot of common sense in the European voter, not yet reflected in the Union as a whole. That I think will break out. And like France has a heat wave and tells everybody you can't have air conditioning. There's a big difference between sort of elite values and what the average voter wants in Europe that has got to get reconciled. And common sense coming from the East, I love that idea of how Europe will fix itself.
Well, we have to see, but anyway, we know there where the power sort of sits in the EU, where the money is, but we shall see. I mean, it's kind of difficult without the UK to sort of balance it out, but Europe is still here. It's not going anywhere. So,
no.
going back to the tariffs, I mean, you have been very skeptical about tariffs, as far as I can tell from reading your comments. I mean, but could you explain how you see their long-term economic impact?
Well, I'm an economist, and your union card as an economist, you have to explain that tariffs are like price controls and rent controls. They are economically damaging. That's fact. And then that leads to, the 101 fallacies. So tariffs are bad. Now, there is a narrow national security argument, but the problem is that tariffs in the U.S. are an answer in search of the question. Trade deficits are not per se bad. Bringing back manufacturing by protecting inefficient manufacturing is not going to help. I mean, I guess I'll let how many fallacies do we want to do? In fact, even trade does not have to be fair. Fair trade, it's not important that trade be fair. It just has to be mutually advantageous. So tariffs are long-term damaging, and the rise globalization was a wonderful thing for living standards everywhere, even in the U.S. So the long-term impact, if tariffs remain, and if we go to a more country-to-country unilateral trading system with big trading barriers, that's just going to be bad for long-term growth. Now, long-term growth, I think some of my colleagues overstated it. Tariffs are not going to by themselves give big inflation. Tariffs they cause prices to go up once, but they only cause a big inflation if central banks respond by seeing the economic weakness of tariffs and then boosting inflation to try to offset that economic weakness. That's what happened in the 70s. They also don't by themselves cause a big recession. Recessions come from something financial blowing up. Tariffs are just one more inefficiency on that sort of slowly boiling the frog of low economic growth. So the sort of thing that happened in the UK, the UK used to be the greatest country in the world. Whatever happened, you guys? Well, economic growth slowed down, and then economic growth really slowed down in the 2000s and 2010s. And now the UK is 40-50% poorer than the US. So tariffs are just supply inefficiency is one of those things that just leads to genteel stagnation. It doesn't lead to an instant recession. But of course, 10 years of genteel stagnation is way worse than 1 year of recession in the end. So it's kind of sad to see one of the great things of the economy in the last 20 years fall apart for no real reason. Now, the fact of no real reason, I do have great hope. Europe gets it. European leaders, for all of their we made fun of them. They understand that free trade is a desirable thing. Now, God forbid that they lower their external tariffs. And I think there's an understanding that within Europe, it's overregulated and that there's still too much internal barriers. The whole point of the European Union is free trade is a good idea. So since that fundamental truth is out there, and so much of the tariffs appear to be one man and a couple of his crazy advisors temporarily thinking this is a wonderful thing, I do have hope that the fundamental knowledge that we've had for 250 years that tariffs are bad for economic growth will eventually win out.
Oh, well, let's hope for that. But so you wouldn't really expect any reindustrialization of the U.S. Rust Belt coming thanks to the tariffs?
Well, you can create inefficient protected industries as long as you're willing to pay outrageously high prices to do it, and eventually people do that. The U.S. Rust Belt, we're guilty of problems that are 20 years old. If there was a China shock and a Rust Belt, the Rust Belt, first of all, decamped to the U.S. South, where there wasn't union labor, and corrupt cities and too high taxes and so forth. Then manufacturing went to machines. The U.S. manufacturing output is higher than it's ever been. We just do stuff with machines. We don't do stuff. We do stuff with machines in the South, not with people in the North. And the Rust Belt has largely moved on to other things. So those cities aren't depopulated. They aren't full of people sitting around on the streets waiting for jobs to come back. They've moved on to services and other things. So bringing the 1950s back is, first of all, why would you want have you spent any time in a factory? That's like in Czechoslovakia saying, let's bring communism back. At least I think most Czechs understand. I'm sorry, I used the word Czechoslovakia, which is an old word.
No, but that's okay.
So Czech and Slovak republics, you would never want to bring that back, although some people are still nostalgic for it. So I don't think it's a good idea, and certainly tariff protection isn't going to do the trick. We're already seeing some of the industrial policy falling apart. The CHIPS Act gave Intel hundreds of millions of dollars to build chip factories, and that's falling apart.
So it's probably going to be bailed out by the infusion of U.S. Treasury capital.
Yeah, and to your state capitalism, actually the Treasury is now saying, and we want a share, an equity share in the result. And the minute the government is a shareholder, the government says, yeah, we want to make money, but we also want you to hire more people and hire more of these kinds of peoples, and we don't want you to fire anybody, and we want you to have all sorts of social goals and so forth. So the idea that this is going to be an efficient job, just come look how a university is run, and I'll show you the opposite of efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Well, once you alluded to it earlier in our discussion about tariffs, that there's still a big question mark about whether those tariffs actually will be collected, and once they collected, whether the government will actually be able to keep it, because maybe the courts will sort of rule against all the tariffs, and the U.S. Treasury will have to pay all the collected tariffs back. Do you see it happening?
That certainly is a free marketer's happy dream. Now, under the current authority of the tariffs that Trump is using, that it's a national emergency and he can do whatever he wants, it's pretty clear he's stretched that to the limit. I'm not a lawyer, and it looks blatantly illegal to me. But of course, in the U.S., the Congress is supposed to be in charge of all taxes. But the Congress has ceded a lot of tariff authority to the president. So that really, if these emergency tariffs are declared illegal, that will stop Trump from playing this tariff game. 50% tariff on you until you do something I want. And then next week, okay, you did what I want. That game will become. But it is still possible. You just have to go through a lot more paperwork to levy all sorts of tariffs for all sorts of silly reasons in the U.S. So we could well end up with a higher tariff regime. And this is, I think it is more durable than I said, because tariffs, like many other policies, it's kind of like if you drink too much. And so how do you stop drinking? Mm-hmm. Tariffs, even if we understand tariffs are bad for the economy as a whole, a business comes in and says, Mr. President, you got to help us politically. And even Ronald Reagan, put in export controls on Japanese cars, and all of his advisors were appalled. And he said, look, we got to win the next election. And so free trade agreements should be easy. We don't charge any tariffs, done. But why don't we do that? Well, because each politician understands if a politician were to do that, his car industry would come screaming, and his farmers would come screaming, and everyone else would come screaming. So a free trade agreement and a global agreement on trade is a very useful way for politicians to do the right thing. Says, look, I wish I could help you. But, our free trade agreement means I can't give you special privilege because I can't give everyone, So I'd love to help you, but I can't. Once it's a bilaterally negotiated, everything goes. It's very hard for governments to get out of giving support to politically important industries. And so I am afraid that the structures that we built up, which are primarily a structure to help politicians do the right thing, once those structures are gone, it's very hard for individual politicians to do the right thing.
Yeah, a couple of minutes earlier, you alluded to Argentinian President Javier Milei, an economist and a very libertarian economist. How do you judge his record so far in his efforts turning around, perennially sort of laggard Argentinian economy with hyperinflation bouts and everything? What do you think?
Smashing success. So a couple of lessons that most of us thought we knew but are not popular. One is inflation can stop without high interest rates and monetary stringency in a huge recession. You just got to stop the budget deficits that you were printing money in order to solve. And budget deficits can be cured by slashing spending, enormous amounts, even in a very leftist ideology welfare state. And once things are bad enough, once you've tried everything else, people will accept doing the right thing. So that it has turned around actually quicker than I thought. Usually these kinds of experiments, there is some sort of recession, there is some sort of hard time, but the Argentinian economy is growing. They removed rent controls in Buenos Aires and rents went down instantly. Of course, if one imagines oneself dictator for a day, you can move even faster and things can move even quicker. But dictators for a day only last a day, and then you go back to normal. So the fact that he still retains political support is interesting. And I just learned Neil Ferguson had an excellent interview of Javier Milei that I encourage you to read on the Free Press. In Argentina, the young people are libertarian, and they are convincing their parents that they should go along with this, unlike the US, where the young people are all socialists and the parents are the conservatives. So that gives great hope for the Argentinian experiment.
So is that experiment a blueprint for other heavily indebted countries to follow?
Oh, sure. It's a blueprint for all of us to follow. I mean, the sort of the classical liberal Adam Smith free market blueprint, if you want to have an economy grow and prosper, it's kind of basic things we know. Low marginal tax rates, good incentives, taxes that raise needed revenue with small economic damage, no tariffs, industrial policies. Most government interventions serve to protect old and dying politically popular things at the opposed of growth and innovation. We've known how to do this since Adam Smith as a matter of scientific knowledge. As a matter of getting it implemented politically, well, that's a political question, which Milei seems to have solved, and that's. But the knowledge of what works as far as economic growth is not rocket science.
Thanks for actually mentioning young people in Argentina and the U.S. universities, because that gives me a segue to, you recently said something along the lines that, in your view, U.S. universities have a lot to atone for. What did you exactly mean by that?
U.S. universities became much more interested in political advocacy than search for truth. And you can look at the numbers. So you look at, say, political registrations. Universities are, 99-1 Democrat to Republican. This is practically a Republican-free zone in universities. You look at what actually goes on, and it is amazing amounts of kooky, extreme left-wing politics being shoved on children, on the kids. Now, fortunately, the new generation is sniffing what garbage this is. The institutions, the scientific institutions got taken over by left-wing politics. Nature and Lancet publish editorials on who should be president. Are you kidding? You can't discuss, you can't teach in medical school that mammals come in two genders. The performative politics, it came under the diversity, equity, inclusion, which wasn't about actual diversity. It was about filling out your diversity statements in a way to persuade bureaucrats that you were a true blue far left winger. Along with that came, a bunch of our institutions fell apart. Our public health institutions in the pandemic showed themselves to be playing atrocious politics with the facts and with science, resulting in a really big loss of faith in science. So there's a lot to atone for. There is basically abandoning education and the search for truth and the clash of ideas, and you can express opinions and discuss opinions and facts, and don't tell me there's a trigger warning and you're canceled and you are now fired because you read aloud from Huckleberry Finn in a English class. The politicization of the universities is something that needs to be reversed. Now, the administration is going after the universities and everybody's screaming bloody murder about it, but they kind of had it coming. And I see signs of the desire for internal reform. The Woodstock generation of liberals was a little bit appalled at what the far left young people were doing. And would like to go back to universities at least as they were in the 1960s and 70s, and I hope that will happen. And there's a lot of junk, very politicized research going on that, along with the bureaucratic nightmare and cost bloat and all sorts of other problems.
Well, you touched on like the presidential administration going after the universities. I mean, it has a lot to do with the government and federal government funding. Is it well set up to actually really help scientific research, or is it flawed? Is it not really helping us to keep the research at U.S. universities at the cutting edge level they have been for decades?
Yeah, the model of university research, which in the United States really came about in the 1950s, and then government funding for research produced enormous gains. But then, of course, like every institution, it got old and bureaucratic and filled with red tape. So that now, people doing scientific research are spending half of their time filling out forms and disclosures and waiting for things. And you can see signs of, the grant-making process. The people who get grants are getting older and older. They're rewarding incremental research, not experimental research that might upend things. So like all things, it's gotten full of red tape and bureaucracy and not effective at what it used to do anymore. And, that's partly the problem. Government support was a great thing, but then government is a monopoly supplier, and people do what the government wants, and the government tends to generate more and more red tape. So I think there's a lot one could do to reform the system. That's beginning. So my friend and colleague Jay Bhattacharya is now busy reforming the National Institutes for Health, with some great ideas about how scientific research should be reformed. I think people see the problem, but when the government runs anything, it may start great as it did, but then bit by bit you get more regulations and bureaucracy, and now you have this big, not very effective thing going on.
Okay, so moving on to Europe and riffing off of your latest book, that you co-authored on a crisis cycle about the evolution of euro. You in the book you talk about a lot of structural vulnerabilities of the monetary union. What could have been done better in setting up the monetary or the eurozone to actually prevent it from going through these crises? And it's actually looking from the inside at the euro. It's actually a somewhat a miracle that actually the euro has survived all these crises.
Well, I and my co-authors, Luis Garicano and Klaus Mazow, we love the euro. We think it's a great idea. Every little country should not have its own currency. That has proved out not to work so well. And especially, there's certain economies of scale. It's part of economic integration, which is, much as I love many small countries of Europe, you're not going to make it in the modern world all on your own with big barriers in your own countries. So it was actually set up beautifully. Much when you look back and you think about how things were in the 1990s, they really thought about some issues that nobody was thinking about. And in particular, you can have a common currency without common fiscal policy. But there's a problem there. And the problem is that a small country, any country might say, great, we will now borrow a lot of money, hand it out to our citizens, and then yell crisis and come crawling to the European Central Bank to say, print money and stop us from defaulting on our debts. That's the central problem of a common currency without common fiscal policy. Now, the architects of the euro understood that was going to be a problem, which when you think about 1990s, that's pretty good that they understood that was going to be a problem. And they put in some rules. There's an independent central bank. It's only supposed to worry about the price level, not supposed to worry about things. It wasn't supposed to buy government debts. There would be debt and deficit rules. Let's go. And we actually don't fault them for not going further. There were some problems right there at the start, but you can't write rules for every contingency when you start. you have to, have experience and then reform things as you have experience. And really, that's our criticism, is that the reform part never came along. Even in the crises. The crises came, the ECB did what it did. Was there an alternative? I don't know. But then let's stop this from happening again. And that's what the Euro institution did not do, is fully reform to solve the problems that came along. Now, what was the problem? If you have a common currency without common fiscal policy, then countries must be like companies. In the end, they must have to default. Default must be an option. A company can default on its debt. It doesn't have to leave the Eurozone. So a country has to be, in the end, the same way. Its sovereign debt must have the option of default, meaning that the bondholders lose money. We don't bail out Greece. We bail out Greece's bondholders. Mm-hmm. Now, nobody could quite say that out loud when we started. So banks still get to treat sovereign debts as if they're completely risk-free. So they have a way too much incentive to hold sovereign debts. So now we have banks holding lots of sovereign debt, and they become hostages. There's no mechanism for countries to default. We pretend that countries can never default in banking regulations. So now if a country does default, all the banks go down. So there's a hostage against actually having a default. But if a country can never default, then in the end, the ECB's got to print up money to stop them from defaulting. And then there's no incentive for the politicians to be sensible about how much debt they issue, because we all know that the ECB will come in, and there's no incentive for private investors to say, hey, I got to charge a risk premium on this debt because you might default, because we all know that the countries can't default. So really that is what needs to be fixed up. And we propose you need a mechanism for default, for temporary help, and in return for policies, the halfway thing. We need a good mechanism for that, which sort of emerged and then was abandoned. And we need to admit, in the end, countries must default, and therefore we need to get banks out of holding massive amounts of sovereign debt that would imperil the financial system if you default.
So when you look at the ECB now, and given that it has actually sort of abandoned its mandate of just like, focusing on price level, isn't it being sort of subsumed by all these fiscal concerns? And isn't it about, or as many other banks, central banks globally, aren't they all about to lose their independence?
Well, I would say yes. Of course, the ECB strenuously says no, and I have many friends and colleagues who I respect at the ECB, and they will always say, oh, no. We're not holding down spreads as fiscal policy. You must understand, our entire mandate is price stability. And on the way to price stability, we have to worry about the monetary transmission mechanism, and markets are fragmented and dysfunctional. So we must hold down Italian spreads because we can't allow the fragmented, dysfunctional markets to get in the way of monetary transmission mechanism on the way to our price stability mandate. Sorry. Or so they will say.
That was perfect, because you went the full circle,
But yes.
We don't hold down the spreads, but we do,
Central banks have gone into fiscal policy clearly in Europe by they're holding down spreads, and therefore they're holding enormous amounts of sovereign debt. Our Fed is holding a lot of sovereign debt in the U.S. And their mandates, they expanded their mandates a lot. It started as financial stability, which was never written in the ECB's mandate, but now that's kind of an implicit mandate. And then they kind of defined financial stability so that nobody ever loses money. I look at what the U.S. Fed did in the, at least in 2008, there was we bailed everybody out, but boy, we're embarrassed about it. Let's try to pass some laws to stop this from happening again. The laws didn't work, but at least they had the decency to try. After 2020, one bailout after another, market support, corporate bonds may not fall, and nobody's even embarrassed about having done it again. So the levels of intervention in the financial system to make sure nobody ever loses any money are very large. And then, buying up, once you start buying bonds, in the US, our Fed buys mortgage bonds, so we're propping up the housing market. The ECB has decided that climate change is the big problem, so they're buying up green bonds. And you're exactly right. If the voters think this is fine, good. But if the voters change their minds, then they say, what were you doing? In a democracy, if you want to be independent, you must stay limited in what you do, because we do not allow, even in Europe, we don't appoint technocrats to run everything in completely independent ways. And once they start doing very political things, they are in danger of the political winds change. And then they say, what are you doing? We got to take back that independence.
So in other words, the central banks should be actually called central banking fiscal institutions. Well,
or they should get out of the fiscal game and retain their independence. It is kind of kind of the puzzle. Suppose you want to create inflation, as the ECB did for a long time. What's the easiest way to create inflation? Print up money and hand it out. Ask any Latin American. We know how to create inflation. What are you talking about? Creating inflation is hard. Central banks are not allowed to do that. What's the easiest way to stop inflation? Go around and take money out of people's pockets. If I take half of the euros out of your pocket, we're going to stop inflation. That's called taxing. Central banks aren't allowed to do that. They're not allowed to do the number one thing that affects inflation, yet inflation is their mandate. Why? Because you can't be independent and run taxing and spending. Taxing and spending has to be politically accountable. So they're allowed to do things on the margin that in some sense don't feel too political. That's the deal we have with central banks. But the more political you do things, the less you can retain independence. Now, you were exactly right. In fact, monetary and fiscal policy are intertwined. And so in some sense, for good or evil, we're going to have to recognize that fact. Right now, when central banks raise interest rates, that raises interest costs on the debt. And when you got 100% debt to GDP ratio, that's a big fiscal hit. So these two things are intertwined, and that's really the fight going on in the US right now. Trump wants lower interest rates because he wants lower deficits. That's a fact of monetary and fiscal policy, which is going to be uncomfortable for a while. Independence really works beautifully if monetary policy doesn't have politically important effects, big distributional effects, or fiscal effects. But unfortunately, it does have all of those things. So that's why independence has always been a bit limited. Well,
I mean, effectively, you have touched on your fiscal theory of the price level.
Yes.
So, my follow-up question to that has already been answered, because it's all really about how policymakers should actually reconcile and fiscal and monetary policies or policy issues in the common currency situation and the common currency market like the Eurozone. How should they go about it? But you've answered that. They should...
Well, not completely. Let me give... So there's a vision that's very important. It's very tempting to print up money to finance deficits, and that causes inflation. So what's an ideal system? How should the euro or the Fed or an independent central bank work ideally? Ideally, it works as a commitment mechanism that we're not going to have inflation, and therefore, fiscal policy must always pay off its debts. We're not going to resort to printing up money to finance inflation. Or if you can't pay off your debts, you're going to explicitly default. You're going to say, sorry, bondholders, you get 90 cents on the dollar or 90 euros, 90 cents on the euro. You don't get the full value. You're going to lose your money explicitly, not through inflation. Ideally, that doesn't happen. The threat of default is that's so chaotic financially that governments will borrow responsibly and pay back their debts largely through economic growth when it comes. And that's a central bank holding the price level. It's a pre-commitment device to run fiscal policies where you can pay off your debts. And that's how good monetary fiscal coordination works. And that's how I would love to see the euro work. And that's how it was envisioned to work. Individual countries shall pay off their debts, and then we don't have to have inflation to pay off debts.
We are actually recording it on this podcast on the 20th of August, which is just on the eve of yet another anniversary of the Russian invasion or Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. So I have to ask you about Ukraine, although it may not be directly about, related to economy and what we discussed so far, but it's a big political economy issue for Europe and for the world. Do you think that Americans, on balance, would actually be happy with just Trump, President Trump and the West just help Ukraine win the war, or really ending the war in Ukraine? What do you mean?
Ending the war can end. Let Russia win. That would end the war.
Yeah, well,
I would not be happy with that.
Okay. Yeah, the Americans really want presidents to be seen as winners, or rather as sort of like followers of some sort of outcomes that happen. Like I'm just alluding to, for example, like Biden abandoning Afghanistan. That probably didn't really help his ratings. But obviously it ended the U.S. involvement in the war. I mean, the U.S. is not directly involved in the Ukrainian conflict. There are no U.S. soldiers' boots on the ground, put it figuratively. Would Americans accept Trump abandoning Ukraine?
I think it would be very damaging for Trump. First of all, if we allow Russia to permanently own some of Ukraine, that's part of the slow walk back for democracy in Europe, and the right attitude from the beginning, I thought, was like what Bush once said in Iraq: "This shall not stand." In Kuwait, you don't invade other countries and grab territory, and the effect of that will be seen in Taiwan if that's what Russia gets away with. So, I think you poll Americans on what you should do right now, and they're mixed. There's a lot of end the war, but Nixon ended the war in Vietnam. That didn't do great for his reputation either. I think Americans reward presidents who win wars, even when it's costly, and even negotiating a sort of Korea-like ending to a Korea-like pause in the Ukraine war, I don't think would do tremendous amounts for Trump's reputation at home. So in the end, Americans may not say fight the war now, but Americans, they like presidents who win wars. And that doesn't look like where we're going. But fortunately, Europe has really woken up. I mean, one of the effects of all this turbulence, I'm delighted to see Europe saying, oh, you know what? We might need some armies and some defense spending and be able to face this threat, which will be with us for a generation, especially if Putin gets to keep some territory one way or the other in Ukraine.
Oh, and certainly, without any doubt, this is a big contribution of the Trump administration. Like that, Europe is no longer Europeans are no longer free riders when it comes to their security, and
but we may he who pays the bill gets to choose the restaurant. So from an American point of view, from a European point of view, I'm delighted to see Europe, and not just spending. It's easy to spend money ineffectively. Brussels knows how to do that. You need to get effectiveness. You need tanks that run and people who know how to use them. Yeah, you need results, not spending. And it's great for Europe to be doing that. Now, once we're not in it together, when China invades Taiwan and Trump calls up Europe and says, I need your help, is Europe going to say, oh, sure, I'll help you there? Or is Europe going to say, well, we're on our own over here, see you later? So alliances were a wonderful thing, and I'm sad to see that go. But anyway, I think it's very healthy for Europe to recognize that they need to take this seriously.
Well, on that note, thank you, Professor, for joining us today. And thank you, our listeners and viewers, for tuning in, and see you next time. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.